So yeah, but that's what he would
Oh, so I was going to explain maybe. I was just going to say you're going to read something from near the beginning and then you can explain.
Yeah.
Okay. Guys, roll sound check again.
Check.
Check.
Test. Testing.
Test.
Testing.
Testing, testing, testing.
I have no reaction.
You have no
All
reaction.
reaction.
Testing, testing.
Testing. Testing.
1, 2. 3, 4. Testing, testing. Keep going. No.
Hello, we've got a full house tonight. Thank you for all for coming. Don't forget to turn off your cell phones, like someone in the back forgot to do, and seriously, it might be me. So welcome here to everybody who's here live and everybody who's live online. The STIIL is a bookstore in Montreal, in case you don't know, and we are very happy to welcome Anita Anand in conversation with Michael Belcher for her book, Convergence of Solitudes. I especially like short stories, and we sell and I buy a lot of them, so I'm very excited by this event tonight. So this is about what we have to tell you. Thank you to Book Hug Press for helping organize this event and also having it online as well as on the STIIL. So I'll let you talk to each other.
Yes, so I'm Michael Belcher. I'm a writer-educator here in Montreal, and I am a friend of this very talented woman whose first book was a book of short stories, and now has this, her first novel out, Convergence of Solitudes. So Anita's also a translator, writer, educator herself, translator of multiple books, and yeah, just an all-around interesting person. So what's she's going to do is she's going to read from the beginning of the book. After that, I'm going to do a Q&A with her, and then end with a short passage as well as a few final questions. And then if there's any questions from the audience, we can get those after that. and then we can mingle. So if there is some beautiful plate up here that was provided by Book Hug, and you can do that, as well as there's going to be some wine, and Anita will do a signing. So I will hand it off to Anita.
Thank you very much, Michael. Michael Belcher, by the way, is an extremely talented writer, so when his first book comes out, please, you can take it from me that it's going to be an extraordinary book. I'm going to read to you from the very beginning of my book, which actually takes place at the end, if that makes any sense. It's not chronological. The scenes that I'm going to read take place in 1996, which is chronologically the end of this story. And it's from the first part, which is called the Prelude, or the Prelude, obviously in English, and it introduces the 6 main characters. So the 6 main characters are 2 couples and their daughters. So one couple is Sunil and Hema, and they have a daughter called Rani, and the other couple is Serge and Jane, and they have a daughter called Melanie, whom they sometimes call Tweety, whom they have adopted from Vietnam. So I'm going to read little bits that introduce Sunil, Hema, Rani, Melanie, Jane, and Serge. Not quite in that order, but anyway. Sunil, what have you done with my keys? Hema's voice reached Sunil in their bedroom, where he was getting dressed. He gazed around, spotted her change purse, and opened it. The silk lining was torn, which made a new pocket just big enough to slide a finger inside. He froze as he felt something like 2 tiny metal buttons. The bugs. So this was where they'd been all along. He didn't want this to be true. His finger pressed against one of them, pushed it up through the lining, pulled it out. Relief swept through him. An earring, a small glittering diamond. He put his finger back in and pulled out the other one. Hema appeared in the doorway. Sunil gave her a sheepish smile. Your jewels, madam, he said. She shook her head and disappeared from the doorway. Before the front door shut, she called back that she was taking his keys. And if I want to go out? He didn't much enjoy being alone with his thoughts. They could be so treacherous. An idea came to him. He'd call Rani. He brightened at the thought of an excuse to spend time with his daughter. So that was Sunil, and now it's our introduction to Melanie. On the bus returning from the airport, Melanie glanced at her mother, fast asleep across the aisle. Someone had left a copy of the Montreal Gazette on the seat beside her. Melanie reached over, picked it up, and began flipping through the pages. The letters page. Surprise, surprise. A Gazette reader had more to say about the former Premier's infamous declaration, blaming the loss of the referendum on l'argent et le vote ethnique. She counted on her fingers. That was almost 6 months ago. God, time to move on. But she was one to talk. Until very recently, she'd spent all her time scouring newspapers from 2 decades ago, way too distracted to pay attention to anything happening around her. Her father would be heartbroken. He'd be livid if he knew she'd basically ignored the last referendum. She didn't care. Yes, she did. Maybe her old self wouldn't have. Poor Serge. The tug of regret combining with shock as she recognized Sunil Roshan's face on the obituary page. So the next person is Jane. Jane stood with her back to the wind. She held the line in her left hand and lifted the kite she'd painted in the other. There were people walking by in the park, mostly people with dogs. She felt their stares. She was alone and enjoying herself, and this would always be considered odd. This was the first time she'd ever taken one of her paintings outside, a swirl of vibrant colors. It was the first warm day of spring. There were still patches of snow mixed with gravel on the field. Her last kite had been a giant fleur de lis, guaranteed to keep strangers and their small talk away in this Anglophone neighborhood. As she let the wind catch the kite, she wondered why she'd never done this simple activity with Melanie when she was a child. The top lifted by the sun now, the pull of the kite, its strength, always surprising. And now it's Hema. Hema was relearning, needing to wear warm socks at night, waking up to an empty bed, eating breakfast alone. At the grocery store now, training herself not to fill her cart with food she'd enjoyed with Sunil. The cashier was the woman from 2 buildings over who'd suddenly started talking to Hema when she'd returned alone from the hospital. She'd noticed the ambulance. "I feel so bad for you," this woman was saying as she placed Hema's items in a bag. "It was the same for me. Such a shock. Some wives are more prepared for the death of their spouses. They get to witness a slow decline." The implication being that those wives were the lucky ones? What is lucky about having to look after a sick person? Hema felt impatience for this woman and cut her off, shaking her head and waving her hand in her face. She walked down the slope to her apartment, with careful, heavy steps to avoid slipping on the black ice. Irritable now, the cashier's words still in her head, causing trouble. Her legs wide apart, shifting the weight of the bag in her arms. A slow decline. It was a shock, yes, of course it was. But her life had not been stable for a long time, always up and down. As she turned the key in the lock and entered the front hall, she prepared for the stillness that would greet her. She was horribly lonely, but she'd been lonely for a while. It was just a matter of degree. And now it's Serge's turn. We're going to meet Serge. The gob of phlegm in his bathroom sink. His bedroom blinds askew. Downstairs in the kitchen, the cutlery drawer pulled halfway open. Funny, Serge hadn't noticed any of this when he came home last night. A remnant of a dream, a baboon with its lower lip out in a pout, the sight of the open drawer resonating now. Other signs gradually registering as he prepared coffee. Yesterday's newspaper on the kitchen table and not in the magazine rack. Fingerprints, blue ones, on the surface of the stove. A ball of pasta in the garbage, a saucepan, and a plate with remnants of the same noodles in the dishwasher. Imagine explaining to a journalist that he always washed his dishes by hand. A changed man now. Really. Fastidious about keeping the blinds straight. Yes, really. That gob of mucus in the sink is not mine. His heart leaping, falling much too heavily, like blows but from inside his chest. Hope followed by the abject fear of it. A memory of Melanie's face, contorted with bitterness, spilling and slurring the last time she was here. Serge, she'd said, instead of Papa. Where was she? Close? Eyes darting around the room, but no, of course she was not hiding in a corner of the kitchen. A possibility, though, of forgiveness, of starting over, like in a brand new country, tabula rasa. The excitement pressed against his ribs, wrapped his stomach in this hard, frozen soreness. Must calm down. Up the stairs to his bedroom, his heart still pounding, but a slow climb like an old, old man. Facing the framed picture of Shiva on his bedroom wall now. Slow inhale, exhale, dropping to the maple floor, crossing his ankles to land in the lotus position, half-closed eyes preparing to receive whatever the universe was planning to send his way. And this last very little bit is introducing Ronnie. On the way to Hima's apartment, Ronnie tried not to think about the last time she'd been on her bicycle, her heart pounding, her head buzzing with a kind of manic energy. Rob believed she was grieving normally, even if she told him what she'd been up to that night. He would have just blamed it on the pills, but she would keep the story to herself. She imagined Melanie saying in an aggrieved tone, "At least you know who your parents are. You can always say, 'I'm like that because of my father.'" Was she like Sunil? Was she like Sunil? Is this how it starts?
Excellent. Thank you so much. So there's so much in this opening that we can touch upon. You called it a prelude. I think of it also like as an overture. So you get like bits and pieces of their personalities, themes that start to kind of come up, and they bubble up, and then the rest of the novel works them out. And so to begin, I just wanted to talk about your writing process a bit before we get into those themes. So first off, I want to point out that Book Hug, the publisher of this, created a really beautiful book. It is separated it's separated like a mixtape, and there are sections that kind of are broken up into dates. We know that we're in Quebec when we see a fleur-de-lis. We know we're kind of referencing India when we see Ashaka Chokra. So this structure, it's structured like a mixtape. You're touching upon music. What are the benefits of structuring a novel like music for you in this story?
That's a pretty hard question. When I think about structure is my weakness. I had a lot of help with the structure from a formidable editor called Meg Story. Also from my husband, who's over there, Frédéric Sanson, who helped me interpret what Meg was trying to tell me. I do think it works as like an album, because you know how when you're listening to an album, the end of a song somehow drifts into the beginning of the next song? I think that the scenes do that here.
Yeah, for sure. And
a lot of it just wasn't really deliberate, to tell you the truth. A lot of it, I sort of write very, almost like in a trance, so.
And so, yeah, because you mentioned one time that you often write in bits and pieces, so sometimes you'll kind of write a scene and not know where it goes. How do those pieces come to you usually?
There are a lot of scenes in this book, and I think each came in a different way. Yeah, I can tell you about the very first scene if you would like, yeah?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so the very first scene I wrote it after, okay, I should back up a bit. So my son was working as a busboy at a restaurant, and he would complain to us about a man who thought he was a big deal, and he would stay late at the restaurant and just order maybe 2 glasses of whiskey, but he would stay for a long time, and occasionally people would come up to him and they would talk to him, but he'd just stay there forever. He was always the last to leave, and my son was not crazy about this person. And one day my husband and I were walking by the restaurant. We just happened to be taking a walk in that neighborhood, and we saw a man sitting on the porch drinking whiskey by himself, and we recognized him. He was someone who was very influential in the 70s in Quebec, a very, very talented musician that both my husband and I really admired, and we sort of whispered about him for a while from a distance. We sort of looked at him and whispered about him. And then when I came home, I was inspired to write about what had just happened, but from his point of view. I was trying to imagine, what that must have meant to him to be sitting there and having people gawk at him from a distance and whisper. So that was the first scene. And then later, I just started writing. I just made up this family for him, and I started writing about the family.
So Serge is the beginning, and so the character of Serge, a Quebec singer, connected a lot with the separatist movement, with all of those referendums that were going on, and so so if that's how Serge came to you, you also dedicate this book to your mother. So how did the other family come to you?
So I'd always wanted to write about my mother and father. I'd always wanted to write about their love story because it just seems so incredible to me. It's like my mother came from a rich background, my father from a poor background. They met during a time of war. They lost each other there's nothing more romantic it always seemed to me than my parents' story, nothing crazier. And then they emigrated to Canada, and then the fun really began. And so I always wanted to write about them, and I wanted to link these two stories, and I wanted to hear what my mother had to say about her life before it was too late, because she's quite old. So I just started writing, and then I had to connect the two. So I decided that Serge's daughter would meet my parents, the people that the people that, they're not really my parents because I just made up a lot of stuff, but the people that were inspired, the characters that were inspired by my parents, that they would meet, that Serge's and Jane's daughter would meet Rani and Sunil's daughter, who is not actually me. So yeah. I needed a link there, so yeah. I gave Sunil and I gave my parents a new daughter, is what I did.
So you have all these characters, you have them set against the backdrop of a lot of history. What was your research process for that history of Quebec, partition, and what was the kind of most interesting things that were coming out of that research?
There was a lot of research that went into this book. I'll tell you about research to flesh out the character of Melanie, who is adopted from Vietnam. I was lucky enough to be given a story. So there was an Australian journalist who was adopted from Vietnam who was in a state of rage, actually. She gave something that was like a TED Talk, but it wasn't a TED Talk. She gave a very rage-filled talk about how she was stolen from Vietnam during a propaganda mission by the United States known as Operation Baby Lift. And I got in touch with her, and she very generously told me her story, and she told me how she felt about her story. She told me about the irregularities surrounding her adoption. She told me how she went about trying to find her birth parents. And, she just gave it to me, and I just made my character Melanie live out parts of that story. I also went on blogs where I read messages that people who had been adopted wrote to each other about being adopted, about looking for your birth parents, about what it feels like to be adopted. So that was part of my research. It was very sad, actually. You think of adoption as a good thing, but sometimes not so much, especially if you feel like you've been stolen from your original parents.
Yeah.
Oh, other research. The other main part of my research was interviewing people about partition, and also interviewing musicians, because there's a musician in my book, right? So I interviewed musicians, including my husband, about composing music, recording music, playing concerts.
Melanie, you're talking about this idea of this propaganda mission that brings her to Canada, and she experiences a lot of loneliness, and we have loneliness in the title, so a convergence of solitudes, and we have that kind of loaded term, solitudes, here in Quebec. All of the characters experience loneliness in one way or another, and we had it even in the opening. We hear kind of Jane happy about her loneliness, like she's out flying a kite, she seems perfectly happy, but each of the characters are affected in a different way. What shapes do loneliness take in the novel, maybe with some of the other characters, both positive and negative? So what shape does loneliness take?
Well, if I think about the 6 main characters, I mean, I can tell you. So Sunil is lonely because he has a mental illness that keeps him in his own world, and he's the only person who sees certain things and believes what he sees. Hema is lonely because she comes pretty much unwillingly to Canada and lives with someone who lives in his own world. And Ronnie's their daughter, and she has the kind of difficulties that children of immigrants have, fitting in either world, in her parents' world or at school. The star, Serge, is lonely because his heyday is over. His dreams of an independent Quebec have not gone the way he wanted. He's probably lonely also because he's famous. He can't just sort of go out and make friends in a normal way.
People point him out at bars and
yeah, they stand there gawking at him. Yeah. Jane is, as you mentioned, she's kind of happy in her loneliness. She's a very independent person. She's in self-imposed exile in Canada from England. She didn't want to stay with people of her own class or of her own culture. She wanted to be in exile. Montreal's a really good place if you want to be in exile, I think. And, well, the daughter, I've already discussed the daughter, Melanie.
So you mentioned Sunil. So Sunil has schizophrenia in the novel. Loneliness is one of the byproducts of that disease. Is there anything else that you wanted to explore when you chose schizophrenia for Sunil?
I think I don't want to give too much away in the book, but the idea that keeps coming back to me is that, what we call crazy is not really crazier than various beliefs out there. I don't want to go too much into it, but I think I'll just leave it like that. Yeah.
So his belief system is pressed up against everyone else's belief system. And what's interesting is that you have these resonances. So you mentioned these characters, and I mentioned music at the beginning, and each character almost either plays in harmony or in counterpoint to the other characters. And so you have these resonances between the two families. So you have Hema, who's wealthy, Sunil, who came from a poor family. Same thing with Serge, who came from a working class background, and Jane, who's wealthy. Why did you choose this dynamic, or why did this dynamic choose you between wealth, the backgrounds, basically, to create conflict, or?
I don't actually think of it as conflict. It's more like interest. I think Hema says at some point in the book that she could have married a prince, but that would have been so predictable, and she wanted her life to be full of surprises. And also, if you have people of different backgrounds in a marriage, it gives you something to talk about. Right?
Yeah. And often they kind of play off of each other, and I see, like, I mean, Sunil brings Hema down to earth a bit, and it's interesting. It's not clear if Jane brings Serge down to earth or if he's the one that's maybe a bit above her. So Quebec, India, Vietnam, there are resonances between these different places. So I just wanted to touch upon some background that I didn't know before reading this novel. So the background of just the kind of connections that Indian culture had to Quebec culture in the 70s and 80s. What sort of things did you notice were just these like little resonances of Indian culture within Quebec when you were younger?
Well, let's see. Can you help me with this, Fred?
I can give you. I mean, you mentioned Buddhism. There's a lot, like there's a picture of Shiva.
Hinduism. Yeah,
Hinduism. Sorry, yeah.
Hinduism, meditation retreats, clothing. Indian clothing was very big in the early '80s here.
And you do mention one of the characters has, like, when they put on what's this kind of traditional outfit, they just feel so different than when white people put that same outfit on.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And why do they feel different?
Well, because she says it just makes her look foreign and poor, whereas if Serge put it on, it just made him look so cool. You know.
Yeah. Just interesting. So at the time, did you see these little bits of just of culture? Like, did you see them as absurd appropriation or something else?
If I think about it too much, then yeah, it strikes me as cultural appropriation. But you know, there's cultural exchanges going on all the time. You know, every time we cook, I would say. You know, so it's yeah.
And I think one time you were mentioning just that in a way it also felt like acceptance.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, like, you know, you can think of it in different ways. You could think of it as, oh, you're stealing yoga and you're not even acknowledging that it's part of Hinduism. Or you could think, oh, okay, well, you like something about my culture. Something about my culture is acceptable. You know, for a long time, you know, Indian food was considered very strange and just sort of this smelly, indigestible stuff, right? So when people started liking Indian food, it was kind of like, oh, okay, well, you like something about me.
For sure. I know my parents still are scared of Indian spices. I'm like, I'm always surprised. So what's going on in the 70s, 80s in Quebec? The referendums, the ideas of separation, these come out in various thematics of the story. So there's a lot of discussion of separation, whether that be between child and parent, between parent and parent. So there's a lot of these kind of divisions, and Sunil, who has schizophrenia, he has these delusions and illusions, which are like, when you believe in anything, it can be sort of delusional. So there's definitely these resonances with Quebec. In terms of division, what are some of the divisions at the heart of the novel? Divisions that, in a way, I see as echoing issues in Quebec as well as partition.
Echoing Quebec, and I mean, that's the book, though.
Yeah, but like maybe what's an A division in the novel that you, let's go with partition because we haven't really talked about that much. What are the divisions connected to partition that you're exploring?
Well, what happened when partition took place was that people who had lived in harmony suddenly started killing each other and blaming each other for what was taking place. Again, not wanting to give too much away, Sunil notices that most people just see one side. They're not willing to look at the other side. They just want to stay on their side and see everything from their perspective. Whereas Sunil can see what's motivating the other side. And I think the characters who live in Quebec are kind of like Sunil too. They can see both sides of a problem. And I think I wanted to write about that because I feel like it's way too rare these days.
It's a lost art, yeah.
Yeah.
Living in the gray is definitely difficult.
Yeah, or just to be able to see why somebody would have a different opinion from you, you know? Just simply that.
I mean, division, of course, in Quebec sometimes is connected to language, but I love that the novel kind of moves beyond that. So, in terms of the character of Rani, she has a very different relationship to French than her parents. So, what is her relationship to French, and what is her parents, and why do you see those dynamics?
Well,
happen?
she thinks, well, I'm living in a province where 80% of the people speak French, so why am I going to English school? You know, she asks herself that question. And, you know, her parents are immigrants from India. English is their second language, so they're not that much in a hurry to learn another language. But Rani has relatives who do speak French, and she's interested in hanging out with them just so that she can, you know, she can learn French, basically. She thinks that maybe this way she will belong, because she certainly doesn't belong at English school.
And is holding on to her parents holding on to English, is there any kind of connection to their history, or is it just because of the added language? Or?
Well, I mean, it's easy for them because they already speak English, and it's not their first language, so learning another language is, you know, difficult for them. But also, back then, it was difficult for you to go to, well, it was actually impossible for you to go to French school unless you were Roman Catholic. Like, you had to be baptized. So, yeah, so like Rani would not have been allowed to go to French school.
Which just seems kind of the opposite as to what's happening today.
Yes,
or what they're talking about,
yeah,
discussing today.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. The idea of identity comes up, so I'm going to kind of lead in with this question to a passage I'm going to have you read as well. Each of these characters has a particular identity that they really hold on to. What is Serge's relationship to his identity? Who does he think he is? And well, maybe you don't answer if you think he is, but what do we get in the first beginning of the novel? Who does he think he is as a figure?
Well, he hopes that his music will inspire his people to be proud, and he hopes that it will lead to independence in Quebec. It will, you know, he'll do his part to. He's thrilled when he hears that René Lévesque thinks of him as a good ambassador for separatism. He feels that it's time for Quebec to be independent.
So it leads into a section I want you to read, if you don't mind. So it starts on page 44. And so this section, I feel, connects to this idea of independence. It connects to dependence as well. And it connects to how the vehicle Serge wants to use to make a change, which is music. So this brings in Jane as well, who's Serge's wife. And so if you would just read that, and then I'll ask a question.
Okay, it's so much easier for me to read than answer questions, so here I go, very happily. Would you leave me the car keys today? Jane whispered in Serge's ear as they lay in bed the next day, her arms around the front of his body. I want to take Tweety shopping for shoes. In the summertime, Serge said. Jane didn't know whether Serge was talking in his sleep or whether he objected to imprisoning their daughter's feet in shoes in June. She waited. Finally, he sighed. Yeah, fine, if you can find them, he said. Jane went downstairs, stepping over the bodies on the floor. These aren't dead bodies. The keys were not, it's not that kind of book. The keys were not on the hook by the front door. She rummaged around in the junk drawer, searched under the pile of sheet music on the kitchen table. Jane counted the bodies on the floor. 3, plus 2 on the sofa bed, another on the child futon. Slight relief. She found a package of rolled oats in the cupboard, but as she was heating up the milk, she saw Hugo, who had been on the floor, rise to his feet and, apparently still asleep, go to the piano and begin playing. Jane turned the stove off and stood in the entrance to the living room to watch the room come to life. Marie-Claire woke up, looked around blinking, and then rolled off the futon onto the floor. She sat up in a cross-legged position, her head and all its hair forward, buried in her harem pants, listening as if the music were coming from inside her head. The other ones on the floor rose, and the ones on the couch rolled off and picked up their instruments. Daniel went and sat in the corner behind the drum kit and sat nodding for a moment before he gave his cymbal a few light, ethereal taps. Serge came down the stairs in a trance and sat at the edge of the piano bench facing the others. He began to sing, his voice softly tracing the arpeggio Hugo had been repeating for a while. Marie-Claire slowly lifted her head and joined in, and they began to paint over Hugo's notes with a jazzy melody. Na 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 na, no words yet. Then Hugo got up and went to the synth, and Serge moved over on the bench, played his melody, and sang. The first sounds from his throat, a cry, quickly followed by a moan. Marie-Claire joined in, and they both began wailing. Marc plucked his bass. Yvon blew a few tentative notes on his clarinet. Stéphane cocked his head, listening, before abruptly picking up his bow and scratching a series of urgent notes on his violin. Serge then sat down on the other side of Hugo and accompanied him with his right hand on the higher keys. Jane walked into the room and sat down on the couch. Melanie came downstairs and wordlessly crawled into her lap. The band members turned to glance at them and then turned away again. Marie-Claire and Serge, with their eyes closed, Serge's eyelids fluttering, his eyes now opening to look across at her. Jane suddenly felt as though she'd interrupted an orgasm. She spotted the keys on the radiator across the room and got up and walked towards them. Serge, still singing na 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 na, followed her with his eyes as she slid the keys into her pocket and sat back down with Melanie. He stopped singing for a moment, closed his eyes, and began again, intelligible lyrics now beginning to flow from his mouth. Jane made out a phrase. She rubbed her daughter's bare feet. She busied herself with putting things in her purse and nodded her head to the music, pretending not to understand his words. She'd make breakfast for Tweety, and they'd go shopping for shoes. Ôtez mes fers, he sang, unshackle me. The others all joined in, their voices like a rising wave.
Thank you. And so out of a lot of amazing passages in this novel, it's one of my favorites. I love the idea of just these hungover people waking up from sleep, just kind of like starting to play music, and it's coming kind of to them. And you'd one time mentioned that you like writing in the morning because it's like a dream state, so it's almost like they're doing the same thing. And so we have this important moment where a husband is looking at his wife and daughter, kind of like watching them, and the words that come to his mind are unshackle me, which if you were someone's partner, you might not want to hear them starting to sing that while being inspired by you. So we have even here this theme of dependence, independence, and Serge kind of needs both, as all the characters do. Do you feel like as humans we always need both to be free and to be shackled?
Yes, I guess I do.
And why?
I have this image right now, it's kind of corny, is of plants. You know how plants, they grow independently, they need space so that the sunlight can get to them, but sometimes they need support, right? And sometimes I'm having difficulty with it.
Oh, it's a good metaphor.
I don't know. I'm not, I'm not a philosopher. I'm just sort of writing what I see. I can't really tell you why. I don't actually know why. I don't have those kind of answers.
But that's a perfect metaphor. The plant, the idea that's both space, as well as like home base, a soil, you need that for life. So a question that doesn't, that maybe is just more kind of open-ended, and writing can seem like, okay, like you have to sit at a desk, but it also can be fun. So was it fun to write these musical sections?
Oh yeah, no, it was a lot of fun. And the scene with the people getting up in the living room, that happened in my house actually, because my husband had a friend he was playing with, and he invited him to stay, and he accepted the invitation, and he also brought 5 other musicians into our tiny place, and we didn't have bedrooms for these people, so they slept on the floor, and they did sort of get up in the morning and play like that.
Amazing. So I want to open up the questions to other people in case they have anything they'd like to ask. You can ask about the writing process, or about anything from some of the themes to the Quebec referendum or partition, whatever you wish to ask. Is there someone who would like to start off and ask a question?
Rhonda? Yeah.
Are you going to tell us who Serge is?
Am I going to tell you who Serge is? Well, he's a fictional character, but the person who was sitting, he was sitting drinking alone that day. The person I wrote the scene about was Serge Fiori of Harmonium. But I just made everything up, right? Like I just, it's like he doesn't have a family. He has no wife, no daughter. I just made the whole thing up.
And harmonium is an instrument. It's often connected to Indian music, but you said you heard it in many different types of music, and that plays a big role as well. So I remember looking up harmonium and seeing Serge, and I was like, is there a connection here?
Yes.
Which there is. Anyone else have a question?
Yes, Deborah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm curious because I quite recently read your first book of short stories, and I was wondering if there was any connection between them, or if there were sort of unfinished stories from the first work that made their way into this, or is this just something completely new and separate?
Well, yeah, the stuff about whenever you see things about identity, things about racism, that comes from me, It's so I think, yes, I think I started to explore those experiences that I'd had as a child in the book, and in one short story in particular, actually, there's one short story in that collection that's maybe 75% autobiographical, called Between Black and White, and it's my story, and yeah, I think I went more into that in this book.
And what's interesting is that, it's not a short story book, but you do still use those short forms, like you have short chapters, you have those short sections. Does that come from from your kind of love of that form, or does it just happen to make sense?
I guess I didn't think of it that way myself. I thought every time I sat down, I thought, I'm going to write a scene, and maybe the scene will be a paragraph, maybe the scene will be 8 pages. That's how I planned my writing.
Yeah.
juggling that many perspectives, and how, like, was there a trick that you used or strategies you used to keep your voices distinct? Because I'm imagining that would be a challenge.
It's less of a challenge if you're writing in the third person, though. You know, if I were writing in the first person, then yeah, it would be challenging for me. It would be challenging for the reader. And the third person, no, not. I don't think so. No.
And did you try with Sunil? You write very short sentences. Did you do that on purpose? Like each one seems to use language slightly differently. Each character.
Yeah, I suppose so. I think I just had the characters in my head, and I would just sort of channel how I thought they would be speaking or thinking. Yeah. But if it were just first person, I could imagine that very difficult, actually. Yeah. Mm. Yes. Hi.
I'm interested to know that, since the story is kind of set in the, I guess, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and you talk about like identity issues, racism issues, and that's taking place in these two societies, which were relatively closed, because India even started opening up to the outside world in the early 90s or I think late 80s, and Quebec somewhat similar, like, do you think that, if the story was set in the 2000s or in the present, like 2010 onwards, how would have those experiences have been different? Like, for someone being raised as an immigrant or as a, Quebec.
I think there are a couple of things. I think it's easier now because people are sort of used to a multicultural universe here, and also those children would have gone to school in French. It wasn't the case in the 60s and 70s and 80s. 60s and 70s, and 80s too, actually, yeah.
But could there have been other challenges that you would have imagined? Hypothetical here.
Yeah. I think the world is a much more challenging place right now. I think I don't think if I were a child now, I wouldn't be concerned about fitting in at school. I would be concerned about whether I could have children, whether the planet was still going to be around. And that breaks my heart. I haven't been able to write about that yet. It's just too horrific. I feel like I've chosen softer topics from the past because we're in a climate emergency, and I don't know how to write about that because it's just too horrible to think about for too long. That's why people don't think about it, I think. The book also, just for your own interest, the book also takes place in the 40s in India, when partition took place. Partition was extremely violent. It was it was much more of a violent struggle than, let's say, the independence movement here has ever been. Nothing here comes close to what it took place in India.
Anyone else?
Yes.
Were there particular authors or short storyists you were reading in regards to partition? Because with the partition literature, whether it's around 1947 or like the separation of East Pakistan and West Pakistan in the 70s, is extremely deep and harrowing and difficult. And were there particular authors you drew from in that?
No, actually, you know what? I made a point of not reading. I made a point of just listening to first-person accounts and interviewing my mother and other relatives. And I thought I would read about it later because I didn't want the writing to be in my head as I was writing. So now that the book is out, I'm going to go back and I'm going to read more. And if you have authors to recommend to me, I would be very interested. Yes?
Short question. How old were your parents in the 40s, like around his turn?
So they met when they were 17. Yeah. Yeah. Yes?
Yeah, one more question. Does your living relatives, how have they reacted or responded to you writing this story? Do they know?
Actually, very positively. Yeah, very, very positively. I'm thinking about one person in particular, my mother, whom I've dedicated the book to, who helped me write big chunks of the book because, I don't know what happened. And she was very generous, she was very honest, but I was still worried that she wouldn't like what I'd written, and she got the first copy of this book, and she really likes it, much to my relief. Yeah.
Any last question? No. All right. Well, you can always ask questions. Whoops. Yeah.
Just I think the theme that you, in one of your questions, you started exploring. To me, it sounded like that you're exploring class, and class in both the societies, like without giving too much away from the book. Like, how was the class structure and the class experiences different, if there are any, or
So both of the women, both Jane and Hema, come from rich families, but they are they're trying to escape. They want to live more interesting lives. They don't want to live predictable lives. On the other hand, I think Hema has some prejudices that she's not aware of. I mean, are we really aware of our prejudices? And they come from being a privileged Hindu woman.
Would you say, and I noticed in terms of Serge, he's able to wear his working class background as a badge of honor, whereas Sunil is not able to do that. He is, I don't know if he was ashamed of it, but the society wants him to be ashamed of it. Would you agree with that difference, or no?
I just don't think that's something that's really explored in this particular book, actually. Yeah. I don't know if it's something that you picked up.
All the way through,
You noticed it all the way through.
Yeah.
Okay. I think you should, because sometimes readers see things obviously that writers don't realize they put in there. So you go ahead and explain it to me.
I mean, I'll let them.
No, seriously, no.
I'll let them explore, but I mean, I do see that because we've talked about this. You have you have an aversion to thinking of literary conventions as such, in the sense that you often say that you kind of write and then other people tell you what literary conventions you're using. So you had mentioned one time that symbolism for you is people tell you and you're like, oh, I didn't realize that was a particular type of symbolism. So for instance, like the harmonium for me is because it's called Beautiful and Broken at one point, and I see the harmonium, which is used by Hema as kind of representing her. And then for Serge, it's this 12-string guitar. I have that right? 12-string? Yeah.
Yeah.
I always think I'm second guessing the 12. But for me, that's an outsized personality. He has an outsized personality. He wants to be heard. And so for me, I just see him all the way through as using his status as someone who maybe is put upon. It allows him to feel special in a way, or try to, because he feels like he's part of this movement. And then when the movement moves on without him, he no longer has that to fight against. And so I guess I see him, the struggle sometimes makes us seem like heroes, and when we don't have the struggle, it can make us seem like fallen heroes, I guess.
No, well, I mean that's interesting. I don't see Serge like that. I see Serge as a very idealistic musician, and he's sad because things didn't work out the way he would have liked them to be. But I don't think of him as someone who particularly misses being famous or feels special. Really, he's got the same kind of paranoia as Sunil has of people, listening to him or watching him. But in his case, it's kind of real, I mean, people do sort of gawk at him once in a while. Yeah. I don't see it as an ego thing for him. I think it's idealism.
You have to see, when you read it, you have to see how you feel about the characters as well. Just one more time, does anybody have another question before I? So we will have time. You're going to be signing books if people would like that. There is a beautiful spread that Book Hug produced for us, or gave it to us. So if you would like any food, you can grab some food. Just be extra careful. Don't eat near the books or over the books. Maybe eat in the in-between areas. And there is some wine as well. So you can kind of mingle. You can ask her some more questions. And we will go from there. I just want to thank you so much, Anita, our guest of honor.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for your challenging questions. I recently recovered from COVID in April, so my doctor says that I cannot infect anybody, and I also can't catch it yet. So I just wanted to let you know, don't be afraid of me. I know it's weird that I'm not wearing a mask, but I think it's weird for me too. It feels weird, but you don't have to be afraid to come and talk to me.
Thank you so much for coming, and please, come up and get a book and get some wine.
You need these mics. Red way to people, so it's like,